This is the Real Christian Manliness Podcast with Isaac and Tim Ingram. Let's get manly.
Welcome, everybody, to this episode of the Real Christian Manliness Podcast. This is Tim Ingram speaking to you from Fort Worth, Texas. Isaac, how you doing today?
And this is Isaac. This is Isaac from Montana. And yeah, I really appreciate that intro. It sounded very radio-like. I try.
I wish you guys could see how manly Isaac looks right now with his tank top on over Skype. Yeah.
The sun's out, so the guns are out.
He doesn't have many gains right now. He needs to lift, bro.
It's a work in progress.
All right. So what's going on?
Oh, just did a little running and now a little recording and some work later. Just living the dream.
Awesome. I have a funny story to tell you.
I'm listening.
So at work, we started 6 new people yesterday in the training class. And we have six people were supposed to be there. At 6 o'clock in the morning, whenever the class started, I had 4 of them there. Well, actually, when I went into the training room, I had 3 of them in there. So I went out to the front to see if anybody else was there. My boss, who wasn't at work yet, texted me and said one person was outside, but he was stuck behind some trucks that were trying to get in the gate. Mm-hmm. So I waited. I went back in the room, and there was a 4th person there. I didn't know that this guy was in the bathroom, and he wasn't the guy that my boss was talking about that was stuck outside. So I assumed he was the person that my boss had texted me about. And then about an hour later, when my boss showed up to work, he comes in with this guy that was stuck outside. Apparently what had happened was there were 2 trucks parked out along the main street, weren't even in line to get into our property, and he was pulled up right behind them thinking there was a line to get in, and he waited for like 40 minutes to get in and didn't realize those trucks were just parked there along the side of the street. So whenever my boss showed up for work about an hour later than everybody else, he saw this guy sitting behind those trucks, and he was like, "Hey, come on around." Yeah. So.
The highest quality candidates for.
Yeah, it's always
the old workplace.
It's always a joy to work with new people.
So this morning, I was going for a run, and this is my story of the morning. I went for a run, and so I was at about mile, I don't know, between 4 and 5, I guess. Maybe I was around 5. And so I'm listening to my music, running, and just out of nowhere, this dog is nipping at my heels, and I'm pretty sure I let out a little shriek. And it's this little terrier that was just barking at me. I was afraid he had bit me, but he followed me down the road for a little while, and then I yelled at him and pointed, "Go back," or whatever, and he took off, but it made me run faster for a minute, I'm sure.
It wasn't like that time we were out delivering papers and you got surrounded by those pit bulls or whatever they were?
Yeah, that time I wasn't running and I wasn't going to run. I was just standing still while they circled me that one time. So
yeah,
I forgot about that.
Nice relationship with dogs.
Yeah, they're all right.
So anyway, you want to jump into our topic for today?
Go for it.
All right. So, as we were throwing around ideas for stuff to talk about and things that might help men, I came up with this idea. So we're going to jump right into it. So to start off, I want to read Romans 12:3 for you. And it says this: "For I say, through the grace given unto me, to every man that is among you, not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but to think soberly, according as God hath dealt to every man the measure of faith." So this is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It's hard to narrow them down because there's so many good ones, so many helpful ones. But this is one that really helps me out when it comes to an issue of pride. And just as getting into the topic, pride is a sin that everyone deals with. I deal with it. Isaac deals with it. Anybody listening to this deals with it. And so we wanted to talk a little bit about that today. And, we had had a youth conference a couple weeks back, and one of the preachers in there had a whole message about pride. And at the very end, he said, if you listen to that message and the thoughts that were going through your head was, hey, so-and-so across the room needs this, then you really missed the point, because that's something now that it's kind of an indication there that you have pride in your life, and that's something that you need to deal with.
That's funny.
Yeah. So we all deal with it. It's when you think about it, it was the first sin that was committed by Lucifer.
Mm-hmm.
It was he wanted to make himself higher than God. He was going to exalt himself, and that's what got him kicked out of heaven. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened.
And then if you take that point even a little bit further down, it was the first sin that Satan used to tempt Eve in the garden. He came to her and he said, if you eat of the tree, you're going to be like God. You're going to know the difference between good and evil. It's you could make a very strong case that it's the root sin of all sins. Mm-hmm. And it's such a huge thing. And since it is the root sin, it's a part of our sin nature. It's a part of something that we all have to deal with. We inherit it from our parents. We pass it down to our children, and we pass it down to our children, pass it down to their children. And it's something that we all have to deal with. So let's move on a little bit, and we'll look at a few things, what the Bible says about pride. And first off, God hates it.
Yep.
He hates it, and rightfully so. If you think about it, he was the creator. He made us. He made the worlds. He spoke it all into existence just with his voice. And we, as the creation, want to think of ourselves as better than what we actually are. It makes sense that he would hate it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly right.
I remember one time whenever this point was kind of cemented and firm into my mind, was working with some kids at church, and a couple of kids were arguing and fighting and pushing each other around. They were probably maybe like third graders, fourth graders, and I went to separate the two kids, and one of the little boys looked up to me. Here I am, about 23 years old at the time, probably about 250 pounds, and this little third grader looks up and said, "Hey, you want a piece of me?" It's like
there's plenty to go around,
right? It's like I think whenever we get ahead of ourselves and we think more of ourselves than what we should, I think God is probably looking at us like I was looking down at that little third grader. It's like, who do you think you are, right? It's like I'm God up here, right? I created you. I can take you. I brought you into this world. I can take you out of this world whenever you want. And, it's something that God hates. Also, pride brings destruction and a fall. You can see that in Proverbs 16, verse 8. I think God brings that destruction, that fall around on people that have too much pride in their lives, just to kind of put us back in our place. Next, pride brings contention. Proverbs 13, verse 10. You ever have two people that just can't get along? What do you think the root cause of that normally is? It's pride. I think anytime Isaac and I have gotten into fights and arguments at a time, there's probably a little pride involved there. Each of us trying to thinking of ourselves more than we probably should, and not deferring to other in certain situations. Proverbs 8 and 13 tells us the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride, and arrogancy, and the evil way, and the forward mouth do I hate. So it's something that God can't stand. And like we said, it is rightfully so. And whenever we fear the Lord the way we're supposed to, it's something that we will hate, something that we're not going to want in our lives.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, your story makes me think of where I work now with these at-risk kids. We just started a new cycle of fresh cadets, and they've been here in the program for all of 2 weeks, and I've been here for about a year, and then there's others that have been here for 2 and 3 years, and another one that's been there I think for 9 or 10 years. and for some reason they think they know how the program works better than we do. And, they'll get into arguments. It's like, no, you can't do that. It's like, yeah, I think we know what we can and can't do. And it's just, and sometimes it's the same kids over and over throughout the cycle that they just think they know better. And sometimes they never learn. Sometimes they figure out that we know a thing or two, not just about the program, but in life in general. Whenever they've been there 16, in life that is, 16 years, 18 years, and some of us have been, 34 years to, there's a 50-year-old that we work with he knows a few things. he's worked with at-risk kids in this program and another program for pretty much his entire life. So he knows a few things. And so when you think of God, who knows absolutely everything there is to know about everything, and we assume that we know better than God, or that we would have done things differently, I can understand that that's got to be reprehensible to God. It's like, who do you think you are?
Yeah, whenever we get, like I said, we had 6 new people start yesterday at my job. And I've talked about this with other guys at work that have been around for a while. These new people that come in, they almost can't stand, a lot of them, asking for help. And they want to just do things, and they won't stop, and they won't ask if they're doing it the right way. They won't do any of that stuff. They just do stuff the wrong way, and then which causes trouble for us because we'll have to go back and fix it, and then we have to teach them how it was done again. And it's a whole big waste of time. And it always comes down to these people. Many of them are just too good. They just assume that they can figure things out. And I told this new class yesterday, I said, there's no shame in you admitting that you don't know how to do something. You've only been here one day so far. When you've been around 6 years or 9 years, 9.5 years at a place like I have, you're going to figure out everything. You're going to know how everything's done. But at the beginning, ask questions, ask people for help. But so many of them are just too good, and they just have so much trouble. And the root thing is pride. I think they just don't want to embarrass themselves by asking somebody else for help.
Yeah. And when we put these examples out, it's not to say that we're as good as God, because we're faulty, and it's good to have the perspective of new people that haven't been stuck in that rut. But whenever we look to God, God knows everything. There's nothing that we can provide help to God.
No.
God knows everything. I just don't want people to think that we think that we're God in these situations. It's just we're making that comparison.
No, absolutely not. It's just an illustration or an example to try to put what we're talking about into perspective.
Mm-hmm.
So, the theme that we've kind of come across with a lot of the interviews and the different discussions that we've had is being like Christ and trying to be a man after God's own heart and trying to live a holy life and a life that brings honor and glory to God. As a Christian man, it's imperative to limit the effect of pride in your life.
Yeah.
If you want to please God, if you want to be the kind of Christian man that this podcast is all about trying to help all of us become, we have to limit that. We have to fight it. We have to resist that nature that we have to try to make ourselves better or to think of ourselves better than what we actually are. Going back to the first verse we read, it said, unto every man that is among you not to think of himself more highly than he ought to think.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, and I know everybody deals with it, and I know that women have trouble with pride as well, but I almost think that men have more of an issue with it at times. And I think there's something about being a man and the macho-ness that we try to exhibit and trying to act like we have everything together. Sometimes we don't have everything together. And I think pride is an issue that a lot of men deal with, and maybe more so than some women do.
Yeah, and I don't know if you plan on covering this, but one thing that's important, I think, is that verse that says we shouldn't think of ourselves more highly than we ought to. So there's a difference between not having any type of self-confidence or self-worth or anything like that, But I think it was just yesterday on a different podcast, I heard somebody say, I can't remember who it was that he quoted, but this one individual would say, humility and meekness isn't thinking, how did he put it? It's not thinking less of yourself, it's about thinking about yourself less.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I've heard that before.
And I really like that quote. I like how he put it. And so it's important to realize that you do have some value, but the majority of the time you're not all that in a bag of chips.
Right. Yeah, I was going to cover that a little bit later. So, like I was saying, it's imperative that we do everything in our power to limit pride in our lives. Mm-hmm. And I wrote down a couple of ways that I think that we can do that. Number one is to remember what you actually are. Mm-hmm. And the verse told us, don't think of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Well, how do you do that? Well, remember what you are. Psalm 103:14. We've talked about this before on the podcast. It says, "For he knoweth our frame," talking about God, and it says that he remembereth that we are dust. When you get down to the root of it, when you get all the way down to the simplest, laying it right down right where we live, we're just dust. He picked up a ball of dust, he breathed into it air, and Adam came into life. So there's intrinsically there's not a lot of value to us.
Yeah.
So whenever you think about stuff like that, and it's like, hey, I'm just dust. I'm not all that. Whenever you start to think of things like, well, I did this and I did that, and look at that guy over there, I'm better than that guy. We're all just dust. And there's no one person is better than the other. And God created us out of dust. Psalm 26, verse 9 says, "Surely men of low degree are vanity, and men of high degree are a lie." Right? Like the man of low degree is vanity, and there's not really no such thing as a man of high degree. They're just a lie. Yeah. They're a lie to be laid in the balance. They are altogether lighter than vanity. Just a couple of verses that I found when I was studying out this topic about remembering what you are, and I think that if you can keep that in perspective, keep yourself in perspective, like the first verse we read said, you got to think of yourself soberly. Think of what you really really are, and if we're all honest, we may have a few things put together, but there's still a lot of junk that we have to work on.
Yeah, I tell my kids at work all the time, I said, as a man, you have to really look at yourself in the mirror and realize objectively who you are. And this is not a spiritual program, just in a practical way. I said, you have to know your strengths, you have to know your weakness, you have to understand when you're puffed up with pride and when you're down on yourself, and try to correct those things. And I think that goes in line with what you're saying. You have to realize what you are in the grand scheme of things, that we're just dust, and there aren't any real exceptional, men out there. We're all just dust. We're all sinners. We're all without Christ if we're not saved, and we're nothing without Christ in general. So it's very true. You just got to look at yourself in the mirror and realize what you are. Yeah.
Exactly, and that kind of brings me to the next thing that I wrote down is remember what you actually are, and the second thing, remember what you would be without Christ. Mm-hmm. We're talking hopefully to a lot of saved individuals out there, a lot of Christian men, and we are dust, we're worthless, but remember what we are now, or what we would have been if it wasn't for what Christ had done in our lives. 2 Peter 1:9 says that, but he that lacketh these things is blind, and cannot see afar off, and hath forgotten that he was purged from his old sins. And I think that verse, that's another one of the verses that just really stick out to me. It's like, you don't want to be blind. You want to be able to see and understand that, hey, we are dust, but we were purged from our old sins. And that's something that Christ did for us. Any value that we have now comes from what Christ did for us and what he does with us. 1 1 Corinthians 6:20 says, "For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's." Through the work that Christ did on the cross and what he did for us, we were bought, we were purchased. And our goal and our desire should be to glorify him in our body. But I think also it says in our spirit, and I think that's where a lot of our pride lies, in our spirit. We get inside there and we think of ourselves more than we should be. Mm-hmm. And then it says, which are God's. He bought us. He paid for us. He provided a way out from our sin. So now our goal ought to be to glorify him. And we're not going to glorify him if we have too much pride in our lives.
Yeah, you're right. Yep. What Christ has done for us, he gives us the opportunity to make something of ourselves. He gives us a framework and a position to where we can have a lot of value in the grand scheme of things, but that's only through the work that he's accomplished in us. And so it says glorify God in your body, which belongs to God. You know, it all belongs to God, and we're just given this space, this little area, which is our own life and our own responsibilities, where we can, make a difference in life through what Christ has done.
Exactly. So moving on, as opposed to having pride in our lives, and we've hit on this a little bit. Number 2, we want to have an accurate sense of spiritual self-worth. And I like the word accurate in that sentence. Yeah. Because that first verse that we talked about said we should not to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. And the key word for me in that verse is the word ought. There is a level of where we should be thinking of ourselves. And we don't need to go above that, and we shouldn't be below that. As Christian men, we need to be able to understand what we are, what Christ has done for us, and use that to fuel our spiritual self-worth. I think a lot of men try to have a physical self-worth and a worldly self-worth based on what they've done, what they've accomplished, how much money they have, how attractive their wife might be, or whatever the situation is, or how many people work for them, or how high they can scale the corporate ladder. But our self-worth shouldn't be derived from that. It should be derived from what Christ has done for us and what we are now through him.
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind, it's a little bit of a rabbit trail. It's like the verse in, I think it's 1 Timothy. I heard somebody talk about, he said, bodily exercise profiteth little. I think it was Brother Sam, and he said, the verse says it profiteth little, but that doesn't mean it profiteth none. He says there's value in working out and being physically fit. It's not a huge amount in the grand scheme of things, and it kind of I think it kind of is a comparison to what you just said, that we shouldn't think of ourselves more highly than we ought. There's some portion of self-worth that can be derived from that. You have to just make sure that's an accurate assessment of what you are.
Right. So because of what Christ has done for us and what he does in us, we can be confident in him, not in ourselves. The Bible talks a lot about things like that, about us being weak and him making us strong and all kinds of things like that. So our confidence should be in him and what he's done for us. If you think about Revelation 1, verse 5 and 6, the Bible tells us that he's made us kings and priests. And that's not something that we've done. That's something that Christ did for us by purchasing us, by dying for us, by shedding his blood for us. We become kings and priests. That's not too shabby. That's in that word ought. It's something that's where we ought to think of ourselves. But it's not because of what we've done. The pride creeps in whenever we think that we're something because of what we've done, and as opposed to because of what Christ has done. And also, the Bible tells us in Hebrews 4, verse 16, that we can come boldly and approach the throne of God boldly. And why can we do that? Again, it's because of what Christ has done, not because of anything that we are. We're just dust. And the Bible also tells us in Psalm 68, verse 19, that God loads us up with benefits daily. That's another great verse out of the Bible. So there's some things that we can And all these verses, and what they have in common is that the self-worth and the things that we can hold on to is based on what God has done for us, and not because of what we are. And another kind of an example about that is we can remember the different truths that come from the story of the prodigal son. We've fallen into sin. The prodigal son, he was a son, but he decided, you know what, I've had this lifestyle. I want to go out and do whatever I want. I'm going to live however I want, and do whatever I want. And I'm sure there was a lot of sin involved in that situation. So because of our sin, because of our sin nature, we don't deserve technically or realistically to be called God's son. Mm-hmm. But then again, whenever the son came back and he said, you know what, just let me be a servant, the father said, forget that, you're my son. He put a robe on him, he put a ring on his finger, and they killed a fatted calf. They had a party because that's the grace of God. And it kind of illustrates how if it was up to us and based on our decisions and what we do, we're going to end up in the hog pen and eating off what the hogs eat, like the prodigal son did. But the Father loves us, and He calls us His son, and He gives us so many benefits and so many blessings in our lives. And again, that's not because of anything that we've done, but because of what Christ has done for us. Mm-hmm. So anyway, to wrap this up, I just wanted to say a couple of things. Number one, as a Christian man, fight pride with everything you have. Mm-hmm. Don't let it get into your life. And, you know, it's easier said than done a lot of times. And I know that there's areas that I have to work on. I'm not trying to make myself sound like I don't have any pride whatsoever. And I'm sure Isaac doesn't have any. I'm sure Isaac has a little bit for himself that he's got to deal with. But you got to fight it. Anywhere you see it creeping up, you know, we have to fight it. We have to get ourselves under control. And
it's like when the Bible says, you know, about not giving place to the devil.
Right.
You know, we mentioned early on how pride, there's a case to be made that it's the root of all other sins. No matter what type of sin it is, it comes from pride and thinking that we're more than we are, or that we deserve something that we don't, or that we're better than, you know, whatever the rules are. That's all a root of pride, or it all comes from the root of pride. And so if we give place to pride in our lives, thinking that, you know, we deserve something, or that we are better than different things, then that's whenever we start letting all these things slip. And I think it's exactly right that pride is the root of those things. So we have to fight that off with everything that we have.
Right. And we can do that by thinking soberly about what we really are. We're sinners. We're saved by the grace of God. God is what makes us worthy to have any sort of self-worth in our lives. It's not our works, but it's His righteousness that does it all for us. And I'd like to close just reading one more verse for you. 1 Peter 5:6. Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that He may lift you up in due time.
Yep.
Another great verse out of the Bible. If we'll do that, if we'll fight pride, if we'll just keep ourselves where we're supposed to be, think of ourselves soberly, not think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think, God's going to do things for us that we could never do on our own.
Yep.
And He's gonna lift us up in ways that we would never even imagine.
Yeah, and when you think of examples in the Bible of meek and humble and lowly people, they were exalted by God. You think of Moses. Moses was, I think people call him the meekest man in the Bible. And, you know, I think he was that way almost to a fault, because he started using it as a crutch, you know, talking about, I don't have the tongue to speak, and I can't do all this. And God said, you do what I say, and I'll take care of the rest. And then you think of Joseph. Joseph was a meek and humble man, and he ended up being the second in charge of the biggest, you know, global world power at the time in Egypt, you know. And he served, and he did what he was supposed to do. He loved the Lord. You know, both of these men did, and God in due time raised them up. You know, Moses was the father of many nations, and Joseph was, second in command over Egypt. And so those are just a couple examples of how if you just serve the Lord and you do what's right with a meek and lowly attitude, having confidence in Christ, then in due season, God will take care of you, and He'll build you up. And it may not be the prime minister of a nation or anything like that, but He'll give you rewards. He'll load you up with benefits, and He'll put you where He wants you to be.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I hope this little discussion about pride and self-worth has been a blessing to anybody that's listening to out there. It's something that I deal with, that I fight with in different areas of my life. But as long as we're fighting it, that's a good thing. If we
keep on fighting.
If we let it control our lives and we let it overrule our decisions and the way we think of ourselves, that's where the problem comes in. So anyway, anything else you want to add before we go?
Just keep swimming. Just keep swimming like Nemo.
Yeah. I think, was that Dory? Dory did that?
I guess so. I haven't seen that in forever.
I think I watched it like one time. Anyway, to all you good Christian men out there, keep fighting the fight, keep being manly, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Real Christian Manliness Podcast.
Adios, amigos. Thank you for listening to the Real Christian Manliness Podcast. We hope you enjoyed our show. Now, if you could do us a favor, go over to iTunes and leave us a 5-star rating. That way other people can find us easily in the rankings. And if for some reason you don't think we deserve 5 stars, give us whatever you think we deserve, but please explain why we got that rating in a review. Now make sure you subscribe and have a great day.